Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake on an historic and emotional day in the Middle East, where after more than 2 years in captivity, Hamas released the last 20 surviving hostages first captured on October 7th, 2023. Their release celebrated across the country, including in Hostage Square, where tens of thousands of people gathered to watch as the hostages were returned. The Israeli military releasing video of the moments some of the now freed hostages were reunited with their families.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
Some of those reunions playing out on phone screens even before the hostages were released from Hamas custody. Today's release was part of phase one of a peace proposal to end the Israel-Hamas War, a phase that also included Israel's release of hundreds of prisoners from Israeli jails. Hamas calling that release a, quote, national achievement. It's a major achievement for President Trump, who's now on his way back to the U.S. after a day-long trip that included meeting with some of the hostage families. He also delivered remarks to Israel's parliament, where he was greeted with thunderous applause. In that speech, Mr. Trump reiterated his assessment that Israel's war with Hamas is over.
This is not only the end of a war. This is the end of an age of terror and death and the beginning of the age of faith and hope and of God. It's the start of a grand concord and lasting harmony for Israel and all the nations of what will soon be a truly magnificent region. I believe that so strongly. This is the historic dawn of a new Middle East.
From Israel, the president traveled to Egypt, where alongside the leaders of Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, the countries that helped negotiate the peace agreement, he officially signed the Gaza peace plan and expressed his confidence that the plan was going to hold up.
With the historic agreement we've just signed, those prayers of millions have finally been answered. Together we've achieved what everybody said was impossible. At long last, we have peace in the Middle East, and it's a very simple expression, peace in the Middle East, and we've heard it for many years, but nobody thought it could ever get there, and now we're there.
In Gaza, meanwhile, where hunger and a lack of sanitation is now a daily fact of life, aid, including food and medicine, has begun to arrive. More than 67,000 people were killed in the past 2 years of war, according to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, and hundreds of thousands more were displaced. Joining me now are two folks who've been covering these historic developments since the early hours of the morning. Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel in Tel Aviv and Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Richard, I'll start with you. It's been a long day there, an emotional one. Talk about the mood in Israel throughout this day.
Well, the mood here has been one of closure. This is a moment that Israelis have been hoping for, dreaming about, praying for the last 2 years. They thought, for many Israelis, that this war wouldn't be over, truly wouldn't be over, until the hostages came home. And today in Hostage Square, as you're seeing right now, people in the thousands were packed in. They were waiting to watch President Trump's arrival, but mostly they were there to see the hostages come out. They were hanging on every frame, every picture. And as you mentioned, some of them came in remarkably surprising ways. In previous hostage releases early on in the war. If you remember, Hamas set free some of the hostages in these theatrical propaganda performances. They would hand them goodie bags like they'd been at some sort of party and give them diplomas and maps of Palestine and then send them off to the Red Cross in rituals that many condemned, believing them to be offensive and manipulative, using hostages for propaganda like that. Today, and it was part of the deal, that was not allowed. Just the opposite happened. As Hamas was handing the hostages over to the Red Cross, the hostages were given phones and they were able to make video calls to their families saying, we're on our way back, we're coming home. So some of the first images we saw were as the hostages were still hostages waiting to be freed, with Hamas gunmen, their own kidnappers, sitting behind them. It's an image I've never seen before. And then the hostages were handed over to the Red Cross, transferred to the Israeli military, and then ultimately reunited with their families, to the great joy and relief of the thousands of people in Hostage Square, and to the millions of Israelis who are following every move of this on television. But, of course, there are two sides to this. There were about 2,000 Palestinian prisoners also released as part of the deal. They were also welcomed home, and most of them returned to Gaza. But what they are returning to in Gaza is not a place that is feeling a sense of closure, feeling a sense of victory, that now they can move on with their lives the way many Israelis feel tonight. They are arriving back to a Gaza Strip that is destroyed. There was one video today where a detainee was released, and then only then did he learn that his entire family had been killed in an Israeli airstrike. So Gaza, in many ways, is just starting a new phase of this war. It is starting a new phase of construction. Yes, some aid is starting to go in, and aid agencies, including the UN, which have long been criticizing Israel for not allowing in nearly enough aid, and Israel has disputed those claims, saying that Hamas has been hoarding it. Even the UN today said that it is starting to see significant progress, that aid is starting to come in. But so much is needed, so much rebuilding has to start.
Yeah, I mean, the pictures are extraordinary across the board. Richard, the other thing that was supposed to happen as part of this phase one was the return of the remains of the hostages who are no longer living. I think only 4 bodies were returned today. How much anger is there about that in Israel? How much is that a potential stumbling block for the rebuilding phase 2 of the peace deal and so forth?
There is quite a bit of anger. There have been several statements put out by both the Israeli, the Israeli Defense Ministry and the Israeli government, saying that Hamas has until Thursday at noon local time to hand over all of the remains of hostages who died while in captivity. And there was an understanding that it would take some time because they could be buried under rubble, and you've seen what Gaza looks like. Only 4 did come out today in batches of 2, first 2 and then another 2, and Israel expressed great frustration and accused Hamas of potentially evading the deal, and threatening that if Hamas does not live up to its commitments, that there would be consequences. And the Israeli military has talked about having to form a potential forensic group that would go look for the hostages. So it could very much be a point of contention. But so far today, that deadline for handing over the reins has not passed. They still have till Thursday. There have been expressions of frustration, these not so veiled threats, but I would say generally the mood here tonight in Tel Aviv is one of celebration and a feeling that finally this is the moment that they had been waiting for, that it has finally come.
All right, Richard Engel, thank you for your excellent reporting across a very long day. I want to bring in Keir now. Richard just outlined one potential stumbling block as this deal moves forward. Keir, you're where all these world leaders were gathered today. How confident are they that this will be what the president says it will be, a lasting peace?
Well, they are saying they are confident. I think they're also relieved because many of Israel's neighbors have felt the instability of this war in Gaza, worried about it. I think what we saw today was the power of the American presidency wielded by President Trump, and also the limits of it. Let me just give you some examples. We were watching President Trump speak at the Knesset in Israel, where Richard is today, when the German Chancellor appeared next to us and said, "Do you mind if I watch on the NBC monitor too?" Incredible, astonishing that one of the most powerful leaders in the world would have time to do that and just stand with us like that. He wasn't with us for long, but what I think that underscored is that what President Trump had here in Sharm el-Sheikh was some of the most powerful people in the world all just waiting for him to arrive, and they had to wait for hours. He was substantially delayed. And then later, after the events here, the signing of the ceasefire deal, and leaders standing around wanting to be just in the frame with President Trump, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, emerged and had time to talk to us. She very rarely gives interviews, but she was effusive in her support for President Trump. She is a supporter of President Trump, but just listen to the way that she described it. Do you believe that President Trump will manage to turn this into an actual peace for the Middle East?
I am absolutely optimistic on this, but in any case, we're ready to provide all the help that is needed. I think the international community has to help him the maximum we can. So Italy is here to say we are ready on the security side, for the humanitarian side, for the political side, whatever is needed. This is a very big occasion, a very great occasion. President Trump opened it, but we have to help him.
Thank you. We're ready to give him all the help that is needed, and he will need help because there are so many hurdles. The hurdles including how to disarm Hamas, how to do what his 20-point peace plan says, which is to remove Hamas from the political process, how to police the Gaza Strip as there is some kind of a transition to a new Palestinian leadership there. How do you get that kind of a Palestinian leadership that is acceptable to Israel and the wider world? And then, as well as that, of course, that huge question, how do you rebuild Gaza, which is effectively a bomb site? All of those things President Trump faces. What he effectively was doing today was trying to say, I know that history has dictated the future in this region for so long, but let's put history behind us. Many leaders have tried to do that in the past here. The question is whether President Trump, with the power of his personal relationships, wielding what we used to call the bully pulpit of the American presidency, whether he is able to do what so many others have not.
Yeah, a lot of work to be done there, a lot of great reporting to be done there, Keir. Thank you for that and for starting our expansion into Germany with NBC News Now. I appreciate your work there today. I'm joined now by Aaron David Miller, who served as an Arab-Israeli negotiator for the State Department. He's now a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I want to start where President Trump stopped today with his idea that this is real peace. Do you believe this war is over?
I mean, look, I've failed over the course of 25 years in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, so I'm hardly the person to be giving advice. But let me make one thing clear. We're not talking about peace. I was at the last effort by an American president, a PLO leader, and a very risk-ready Israeli prime minister at Camp David, at a two-week summit, and the 5 core issues, border security, Jerusalem, refugees, end of all conflict and claims. By the end of that summit, the gaps were as wide as the Grand Canyon, and nothing that has occurred in the last 25 years, not even this, has narrowed those gaps. What this is a chance to create a roadmap that over time could actually, assuming everybody's willing to do the heavy lifts, end the war in Gaza on terms that normal humans would regard as an end to the conflict. But that is by no means guaranteed. We throw this word of peace around. It's an aspirational goal. I believe at some point it's possible, but it's going to be very, very hard. And whether or not the president is prepared to display the force and will that he displayed in pushing Benjamin Netanyahu and leaning on the other Arabs to push Hamas to agree to this is far from certain.
Well, so to that end, if today is the celebration, what's tomorrow look like? Is tomorrow the hangover, or is there real opportunity to build on this Tell me what you think that looks like.
I mean, you broke the code. The hardest thing after a peace conference, I've been to many, is the Monday morning, is the day after. I mean, if I were running the railroad, sorry, I'm contradicting my own stricture myself, not to give advice, I would not have left Sharm without appointing, under senior U.S. management, a working group to deal with how to create an international stabilization force. Another one on what to do about Palestinian governance. Another one on decommissioning, demilitarizing Hamas's weapons. And then one on humanitarian assistance and reconstruction. I would put it all under the charge, I would have figured, having worked for 6 secretaries of state, of the U.S. Secretary of State. And from now on in, it would be 24/7 in using American persuasion, disincentives and incentives to begin to create and deal with the practical realities of precisely what is going to be required. Look, I will not take anything away from what the president has done. The hostages, their families, some degree of relief for 2 million Palestinian citizens of Gaza, but it's going to be very hard to turn this into ending the war.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll put my White House correspondent hat on here for a minute and just tell you what Donald Trump's not going to do is he's not going to create working groups and that kind of organizational structure that you laid out. That's just not the way that this administration likes to work. But I want to ask you about one party to all of this, which is Hamas. They were not present in Egypt. Neither was Israel, by the way. You can delve into whether you think that matters or not today. But what does a post this phase of the war, let's call it, post-hostage release Hamas look like? Do they have any leverage left?
Yeah, they're the strongest and most coherent political group in Gaza today.
Still.
And they exercise influence through intimidation, through co-optation, and through violence. The thousands of Palestinian police on the streets over the last several days, who do you think created the mandate for them to deploy? And while Hamas will not govern Gaza again, I suspect, to defeat it, to replace it, requires... you followed White House politics. You can't be something with nothing. You need an alternative. And that means it doesn't mean a board of peace necessarily. If part of that board of peace is the empowering of a credible, legitimate, authoritative Palestinian leadership committed to not just Gaza, but to sort of turn back Israeli annexationist policies on the West Bank. I mean, somebody's got to deal with the details. You don't have to call it a working group. And I know it's not the way President Trump operates. He now has added the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the 7 other conflicts that he's resolved. He hasn't resolved 7 conflicts. And he hasn't resolved this one. Some structure, some coherence, I think, is going to be necessary. Or you and I are going to have this conversation next year.
All right. Well, Aaron David Miller, we'll leave it here for this year. Thank you very much. And we'll pick up right where you left off now with my next guest, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. I can't think of a better place to start than right there. Who does bear the responsibility now for ensuring that this peace, however tenuous it might be today, holds tomorrow and into the future?
I think basically it all depends on the determination of President Trump and his capability to keep his attention focused on it in spite of the disappointment with the Nobel Prize. Basically, what had been achieved would not have been achieved without him being ready to bend Netanyahu almost like a rubber doll. He basically dictated to him everything. The same way dictated him a few months ago the U-turn over the skies of Iran already of a group of Israeli jets, which he ordered to go back home. And his other success was the capability to mobilize the Turks, where the Turks and the Qataris together, when they are surrounding the Hamas doesn't have a lot of alternative and he has to submit. So basically, I think that all depends on Trump. If he will be kind of decided and determined, I don't see a problem to bring within a few weeks, and it's really urgent. It cannot wait for several months. Few weeks we should see an inter-Arab / Muslim military force entering into the area, probably through the areas held already by Israel, and taking over the order in the street, as Hamas sees to do it. And then there is a need to build a technocrat government and to reactivate the Palestinian bureaucracy, probably with certain involvement of Ramallah, of the Palestinian Authority. All these are concrete steps should be taken in order to keep it flying. If steps will not be taken, inertia will take over, the dynamics will be negative.
You wrote in Time this idea that Hamas, you said you thought was militarily defeated maybe a year ago. They're obviously still a political force. To Aaron David Miller's point, what does a post-Hamas leadership look like in Gaza? Can you create something out of nothing that is a more appealing political alternative for the Palestinian people?
Yeah, so basically the idea of a technocratic government is okay. The only two conditions that Israel can put are, number one, not a single individual who was part of the military wing of Hamas can take a role in any organ of this new entity. And secondly, the final result to the border cannot take place before all the pre-agreed security-related milestones had been met. So that's the only demand of Israel. So if we have to see the technocrat government, for example, established, it's not a problem. It's not about ideology. We do not interfere in the ideologies, only in operations. So some of the best experts might be Fatah, namely related to Ramallah, and some might be Islamists. We do not and should not pretend to penetrate the dreams or wishes of individuals, only their record and actions. So I don't see a problem. This kind of technocrat government was discussed more than once in the last decade and a half among the Palestinians themselves. It's not something new that they don't know. And you cannot replace the bureaucracy. This is the same 50 or 60,000 people who already are the bureaucracy of 2.2 million. The only thing that probably there is need to inject into the system some 1,000 or 2,000 of Fatah people in order to make sure that it's not de facto being run by Hamas.
But that kind of hands
Hamas
off.
is ready to give up. Hamas is ready to give up its.
I'm just worried that kind of hands-off approach is not Netanyahu and the Israeli government's preferred approach here. I want to ask you about Netanyahu before we run out of time here, Mr. Prime Minister. Obviously, his political future has been so closely tied with the outcome of this war. What do you think his political future is? And what did you make of President Trump floating the idea of a pardon for Benjamin Netanyahu today?
That's pardons are not the business of American president, probably of our president. I'm not sure that it will be even discussed, and because it's involved many preconditions to even consider a pardon. But I think that Netanyahu, for sure, he wants to stick to power. That's one of the reasons why he did not let the war to end. As I mentioned, the Hamas was, as a fighting force, it was defeated more than a year ago. Now there are groups of, small groups of not fully organized, guerrilla, so to speak, terrorists, who can be there even years from now. We still have small groups of people with weapons that belong to Hamas in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, where we already controlled the area for 58 years. So it's Netanyahu wants to stick to power. The question what the Israeli people will say, I hope and believe that they will say thank you. And I use Netanyahu's quotations, his own quotation when in 2006 he was talking about his predecessor, Ehud after the Second Lebanese War. He said the following, life of a nation is not a personal survival track of a failing prime minister. He said in another, he used the metaphor of the Titanic. He said, to tell us that the one who failed and created all these all his predicament, is going to be the one who will repair it. It's like telling that if the captain of the Titanic would have survived, he should have been given the command of the new ship. So it applies to him as well.
All right, former Prime Minister Barak.
Be over.
We will leave it there with the Titanic imagery. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, you bet. We'll have more ahead, including what's next for the freed hostages as they adjust to life back home after an unspeakable 738 days in Hamas captivity. A former Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs joins me ahead. But first, the latest on the ongoing government shutdown as President Trump orders the Department of Defense to keep paying members of the military and as mass layoffs take effect across other parts of the government. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. On a day of massive change overseas, here at home, the news is that, in fact, nothing has changed. It is day 13 of the government shutdown with no end in sight. The Senate will vote tomorrow on a funding bill that has already failed 7 times, and the House remains out of session with no plans to return to Washington this week. The leaders on both sides are making clear on the airwaves this weekend that they're still dug in.
Well, House and Senate Democrats have taken a principled position in defense of the American people to protect their health care. So even Marjorie Taylor Greene agrees that we have to address this health insurance crisis right now.
They shut the government down October 1st. We had always been counting on using these 4 weeks in October to finish up those discussions.
And I think it's important for all Americans to know that this fight right now over this government shutdown is about one thing. It's about the cost of their health care.
Whether the government shut down or not, I'm not going to vote to extend these subsidies without great reform. And to my Democratic colleagues like Mark Kelly, who I like a lot, I'm not going to talk to you with the government shutdown.
Meanwhile, as no government October continues, members of the military will be paid this week, according to President Trump, who's directing the Defense Department to use, quote, all available funds to make it happen. At the same time, the administration is making good on its threats of mass firings for other federal employees, with more than 4,000 workers across 9 agencies receiving layoff notices. But some of those layoffs at the CDC are being reversed after hundreds of scientists received what an official familiar with the matter tells NBC News was a, quote, incorrect notification due to a glitch in the system. This weekend, Vice President Vance blaming the layoffs on congressional Democrats while speaking with Kristen Welker here on Meet the Press.
We don't want to be in this situation. We don't want to be laying off federal workers, but the Democrats have shut down the government. They have forced us to choose between American citizens and federal bureaucrats. We're choosing the benefits, the critical services that benefit our American citizens.
Joining me now is the hardest working person left on Capitol Hill, my NBC colleague, Julie Sirkin. So, Julie, the Senate is going to vote again tomorrow. Are we expecting any different outcome? And what of this plan to search the couch cushions for money to pay the military? Is that legal?
Well, that's a really good question. And in talking with Democratic sources, it's going to be a really hard line for them to walk in making the argument that this isn't legal. It very well might not be, because the administration does have a transfer authority in their budgets every single year. Some folks think the administration may have already used up those funds in other projects. Others think this is flat out illegal to take about $8 billion that was appropriated by Congress to research and development and kind of move it around in ways that they wish to pay the military. But Democrats are probably not going to make much of it publicly, because it is, of course, unpopular to go against paying our troops, and they know that, and so does the president. I am perhaps the only person up here, myself and our photographer John Bullard, except for the speaker, who made a brief appearance this morning, making it extremely clear that not only are they not going to extend these Affordable Care Act subsidies, which are expiring, but they're also not really clear and certain that they're going to have a plan to reform it. We heard repeal and replace during the first administration, the Trump administration, that is. It didn't work then. It is unlikely to work now, especially in the time frame that they are working in and the votes that they have in the House particularly. But Democrats, Garrett, completely not backing off. I'm told the vote totals tomorrow, when the Senate tries for an 8th time to reopen the government, are probably going to look the same. Just 3 Democrats joining Republicans time and time again to reopen the government and turn the lights back on. There was a point in time last week in which Angus King, an independent from Maine who caucuses with Democrats, said, hey, maybe I will switch my vote to no, because of course he wants wants to help his Democratic colleagues try and put some pressure, use their very limited power in the minority to hold up government funding in exchange to make health care stronger. He backed off his threat, saying that, look, all of these layoffs, everything that's happening is giving us absolutely no control as the executive branch is in the driver's seat here. So the TLDR, the long and short of it for Americans, is that unfortunately this shutdown is going to continue probably at least this week, Garrett.
Julie Sirkin with the fine reporting echoing down the Will Rogers hallway. Julie, thank you. And joining me now is our panel, Daniela Diaz, congressional reporter for Notice, Taryn Rosenkrantz, Democratic strategist and founder and CEO of New Blue Interactive, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch. Daniela, I'll start with you in the news that the president has now ordered the Department of Defense to pay the troops here. Republicans had been using that as a pressure point, saying that money's in the CR. You got to vote for the CR. We got to get this over the finish line. Is the president undermining the Republican position here? What do you make of this?
I mean, the whole point of Congress is to appropriate funds. And if Trump is going to do this on his own during a government shutdown and buying allegedly probably time for there not to be a deal or any sort of negotiations between Republicans and Democrats. I mean, he is in a way undermining his own party in Congress. Look, this is really, really messy. It's probably, we were just talking, one of the most tricky shutdowns ever because they're not even negotiating. They're not even talking. Usually by now, in past shutdowns, I've covered the last couple that have happened in the last 10 years, they're talking. They're not talking right now, and they're hoping, you know, what we're seeing publicly from Speaker Mike Johnson is we're going to keep, and Majority Leader John Thune, we're going to keep trying to put pressure on those moderate Democrats in the Senate to switch their vote. You just heard Julie. They're not planning to do that. That's what my reporting is saying. Those 3 Democrats, well, 1 independent technically, and 2 Democrats are the only ones, Fetterman, Cortez Masto, and Angus King, are the only ones that are going to continue to voting for that CR. There will be no others tomorrow when that vote happens.
Eighth time won't be the charm. Stephen, the only people who like a deadline more in Washington than the journalists are the lawmakers. By paying the troops, the president is effectively removing a deadline that could sort of force the issue here. What happens now?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at this from the perspective of Republicans, it's true that he might be undermining them on sort of narrow policy points, but look at the big picture.
Right.
You have a president of the United States who's overseas right now, who's plainly made progress on an intractable international issue that's been intractable for centuries. Now, whether that'll hold or not, that's another question. But he's made progress. And I think if you're the American people, if you're not inside the Beltway, if you don't know a federal worker, you look at this and you say, well, Washington's shut down. That doesn't seem to be keeping the president from making progress on these things. And if he can go and sort of pick and choose, and I think it's very questionable legally. I think it's problematic for our system of government. It presents constitutional issues, of course. If he can go and pick and choose and sort of remove the places where Republicans might have to feel pressure by just saying, yeah, I'm going to pay the military. That would be bad for Republicans if we didn't pay the military, so I'm going to do it.
Right.
If he can do that effectively, I think that means this goes on for a lot longer.
Taryn, he's made it pretty clear he's not going to remove the pressure points for Democrats. If the next things up are, you know, WIC and some of these other popular programs that Democrats are focused on, they start feeling the pain here. Is that what changes the dynamics of who's under pressure here to make a deal?
I think this is one of the most unpredictable shutdowns, as we mentioned, and mostly because of him being, threatening that he's going to go after to lay off these folks who are, have leaned Democratic. I mean, he's just making these threats. He's making this so chaotic. This is on the heels of Doge. This is on the heels of this inefficiency and all these different things that were under the vein of efficiency. I think we've got people who are hurting, and it's really affecting the economy. And he's saying, don't worry to these military families about your paycheck, because he's never had to live paycheck to paycheck. But the ripple effect of not paying federal workers, most of these federal workers you're saying are in this D.C. DMV, but that's not actually true. There are a lot in the state of New Mexico. There are a lot in these states all across the country. Nationally, we have federal workers, and the impact of those folks in these different places really has a ripple effect on our economy, which is already shaky. It's already expensive at the grocery store. It's already expensive a lot of places. And I think we're all worried, like, what is this going to mean overall? And I think that's where you get that pressure. We had 4 years with the Democratic administration and even in a divided government, and we still didn't have a government shutdown. The last time we saw this shutdown, we're all not talking about it, was the first Trump administration.
That's right.
We need to be able to negotiate, and I think at some point there's going to be some Republicans worried about their jobs who are going to say, I got to come to the table. People are going to realize the last time we did this was Trump, and we didn't do it for 4 years. We had a break from people trying to really come together and negotiate.
Well, I don't know about that. Broadly speaking, there wasn't always a good faith effort to negotiate. And the numbers here are confusing, too, because when we pull back, Reuters has a new poll. We can put this up on the screen that show who people blame. In this place, it's kind of a mess. Republicans in Congress, 67%, Trump, 63%, but Dems get 63%. Then you shift it over to who do they blame most, and it's Trump and Republicans in Congress. The numbers change a little bit. How much? Yeah, here we go. It's the second set of numbers. Trump gets some of the share of the blame. Dems in Congress get a share of the blame. Republicans actually get less of the blame in terms of congressional Republicans. Stephen, you mentioned the president. He's kind of on this high overseas right now. I look at those numbers, and I think the people who have the most room to potentially be worried are Democrats. Yeah. How do you see those numbers changing?
Well, I think that's how Republicans see it. I mean, I think if the case that Taryn made were true across the board, if that's the way that people felt this, if it was the case that, boy, Democrats were going to be able to say, look, we're going to see economic ripple effects from this, and the President of the United States is responsible, they would be in the catbird seat. But I don't think people are there yet. And I think it's a hard case to make that the economic challenges we're facing now are in any way attributable to this shutdown. But I think the bigger challenge for Democrats is making people blame the president and blame Republicans for this shutdown.
Danielle, I feel like when we see these things, the party that tends to be the most united wins here, but the party that, which I guess you could argue is Democrats right now, but the party who brings the extraneous outside issue tends to be the party that loses. That's also Democrats here. What pressure does the Democratic leadership under now to find some kind of off-ramp here to say that's enough to start, trading votes here?
Well, I appreciate you asking about that, Garrett, because I just wrote about it.
Wow, on notice. We'll have to go find it.
Yeah, on News of the United States. But anyway, they are more united now than they've ever been. I mean, remember back in March, we all covered that as well, and we saw Leader Schumer get so much criticism for folding without any sort of negotiations, and they're incredibly dug in. I mean, it seems like they might be dug in, and the discussions behind the scenes are for weeks. They think this is a winning issue. They think that while maybe not all Americans understand what they're fighting for just yet, they will November 1st when people get notices about the ACA subsidies and enrollment opens up for health care. So when I talk to these Democrats on Capitol Hill, because I've been covering the shutdown every day, not like Julie currently on Capitol Hill, I'm here, but I've been there, and it's clear that they feel very confident about this. And we're also seeing Republicans really stick to their guns as well, even moderates. I mean, I was there when we saw Mike Lawler, a very moderate Republican, fighting with Democratic leadership, saying, look, we're trying to solve this, and you're not negotiating with us on 1-year ACA subsidies, which, of course, Leader Jeffries has already said is a non-starter. But this is just so messy, and they're not, the leadership at least, coming together yet to negotiate this. It could potentially be moderates, rank and file, starting those conversations, like Jeanne Shaheen, senator, who is very interested in ending this ASAP. But the negotiations are not there yet.
We're up against the wire, but I want to get one more topic in. I'll go to you on this, Taryn. We've seen these indictments in recent days. Letitia James Comey. We have some reporting that John Bolton could potentially be indicted here in the not-too-distant future. This is an area in which the president's activities have been largely unpopular, not necessarily relating it to the shutdown. But how do you see a potential, third indictment of a presidential enemy in roughly as many weeks playing into these discussions more broadly and perhaps bringing the pressure on the president up a little bit here?
Yeah, I mean, I do hope that it puts some pressure on the president, because I do think these revenge tactics and venge tactics are not popular. And I think that people are really scared about the slippery slope we're seeing. This feels really uncomfortable. And it can be bad for Republicans when Republicans aren't in power. Like, you got to think this through. This is why our country is so great. We have this freedom of speech, and we have these abilities that we have this protection that our president isn't going to come after us like some of these other countries we fought so hard to bring democracy to.
All right, Taryn, Stephen, Daniela, we have to leave it there on day 37 of the shutdown. We'll bring you all back. We'll do this again. It'll be great. We'll see what's changed. But for now, we got to leave it there. Up next, President Trump's attempt to deploy the National Guard to Chicago faces another legal roadblock as Vice President Vance addresses whether the president will invoke the Insurrection Act. We're covering all that straight ahead on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. A federal appeals court blocked the Trump administration from deploying the National Guard in Illinois, but said it could remain federalized as the battle over troop deployments in Democratic-led cities across the country intensifies. And it comes as Vice President Vance told Meet the Press that the president has not ruled out invoking the Insurrection Act to carry out military deployments in U.S. cities, linking it to a larger crime crackdown.
Well, the president's looking at all of his options. Right now, he hasn't felt he needed to, but we have to remember, why are we talking about this, Kristen? Because crime has gotten out of control in our cities.
Joining me now is NBC legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach. So, Gary, this blocks the deployment of the troops, but they can remain federalized. Feels like sort of a split decision here for the administration. What does it mean for these actual troops? And doesn't this just put us on a collision course with an eventual Supreme Court ruling on this?
Well, it absolutely does. And it's not great news for the Trump administration here, because what they want is members of the National Guard on the streets of Chicago and on the streets of Portland. And that's not what they have right now. What they have is members of the National Guard sitting in these states, not getting paid and not on the streets.
So what is it a matter of convincing these judges that there is sufficient insurrection and sufficient bad stuff going on, or that they actually don't have the power? It seems to me if the judges are ruling that these troops can remain federalized, the stumbling block here is the judges have to decide there's enough for them to do.
Well, there's a big question here that some of the judges are dealing with about presidential deference. How much power does the president have? The Supreme Court in the past year has said the president has quite a bit of power. And if one of these cases does end up getting to the Supreme Court, which we do expect to happen in the coming weeks or months, there really is a real good chance that they may say, yes, the National Guard actually is controlled by the president and he can do whatever he wants. That's game over for all of these cases all around the country if they do rule that way.
Is there also a risk that you'll have an appeals court in Oregon come up with a completely different set of facts than the appeals court in Illinois, and you'll basically have like an East Coast, West Coast division on what the president can do?
Well, you may start to see that here because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is over in California, they're the ones that are in charge of the Oregon case. They said, and it appeared very likely, that they would stop the lower judge, meaning allow the Trump administration to deploy those National Guards people. The Seventh Circuit said, no, you can't do that. So you're already starting to see this circuit split here. That's what we call it. And that's when the Supreme Court could get involved.
Yeah, I'm marking my calendar for the Supreme Court hearing on this. Gary Grumbach, thank you for your reporting. And after the break, markets rebound after a tumultuous 48 hours for U.S.-China trade relations that started with President Trump threatening an additional 100% tariff and ended with him saying, quote, "It will all be fine." You're watching Meet the Press now. It'll all be fine. Welcome back. President Trump is suggesting trade tensions could ease with China in a Truth Social post over the weekend, writing, "Don't worry about China. It'll all be fine." And the USA wants to help China, not hurt it. The post came after several days of back-and-forth trade tensions, with President Trump announcing Friday that he would hit Chinese goods with a 100% tariff, quote, over and above any tariff they're currently paying in response to China's move to institute export controls. A reminder, American importers pay those tariffs, not China. Chinese officials said Sunday they would not back down in the face of the president's threat. Joining me now with the latest is NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. So, Brian, what is the latest on this back and forth with China? Is the president now backing off these threats just days after making them?
Well, I think that the words are pretty remarkable in that Truth Social post about a day ago, where he said, "Don't worry about China, it will all be fine." What people were worried about was a concern that he himself had fanned in other remarks on Truth Social earlier in the week, last week, where he said he was worried about the Chinese new imposition of these types of export controls. Basically, there are these rare earth minerals which are really critical to the development of electric vehicles as well as AI infrastructure around the world. China announced that they would be imposing these strict export bans and limits to the rest of the world. The president clearly not liking that, and then threatening a 100% tariff on top of the existing tariffs on China. Again, this would take effect on November 1. Again, whether or not this is just a threat, something to get China to the negotiating table, is an open question. But I think one important point of clarification, the president also suggested last week he might cancel his meeting with President Xi Jinping of China at a forthcoming meeting in South Korea. But Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, saying on Fox Business this morning that that meeting is likely still on, Garrett.
Well, Brian, you know a guy who's supposed to go to that summit and cover that meeting. It's supposed to be right before November 1st. Yep. I mean, don't we think the likelihood is this is raising the stakes ahead of a meeting where they can back off or come up with some other deal?
Yeah, look, well, for anyone that might be going to that meeting to cover, I wouldn't cancel your tickets because I think the idea here is that it's a big APAC conference. There's going to be a number of heads of state that will be meeting there. But I think the idea is that the president wants to use these Truth Social posts to tee up some sort of conversation with China, not just on behalf of America. He was kind of interestingly saying on Truth Social, he was kind of speaking on behalf of other nations that saw this as a thorn in their side by trying to limit rare earth minerals to the rest of the world and basically trying to hoard all of them for domestic production in China. I think that that would be a fascinating conversation that is going to definitely set the table for those APAC negotiations. But again, we'll have to see whether or not the president is intent. I want to point out this is not the first time the president has imposed or threatened to impose some sort of like 140% tariff. That was the exact same number we were basically talking about just a few months ago, Garrett.
I'm struck on the fact that between the Ukraine piece of this and the China piece of it, we've all, as Americans, heard more about these rare earth minerals in the last 6 months than I think most people had heard of probably before in their lives. There's a lot more reporting to do here. Brian Chung all over it. Thank you very much. And still to come, we're turning back to the breaking news overseas as all 20 remaining living hostages reunite with their families more than 2 years after the horrific October 7th attacks. A veteran diplomat and expert on hostage affairs joins me next. Keep it here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Moments like that taking place in Israel today as Hamas released the last 20 surviving hostages more than 2 years after they were captured. Joining me now is Roger Carstens. He's a former Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs and now a distinguished senior fellow at the McCain Institute. Roger, more than 2 years of negotiations, preparations, back and forth. What do you make of this moment just generally?
I have to focus on the actual day. It's a day of celebration in Israel. It's a joyous day, but it's also a day of grief as people recall the loss that they've all been through. And additionally, there was an expectation that more of the deceased would return. Of the 28 that were expected, only 4 returned. That leaves 24 deceased yet to be returned, and that includes 2 Americans. So while it is a day of celebration, it is a day where people are still feeling that loss.
I've been trying all day to just get my head around the idea of what these hostages went through. I mean, for some of them, probably haven't seen sunlight in close to 2 years. What are they going through right now in this first day back as free people?
You know, having experienced this a few times, they're obviously feeling a lot of joy, but they're also probably being told by the military psychologists that they're about to go through some periods of intense mental pressure, mental grief. They'll be walked through this by a team of professionals. The Israelis have truly mastered post-isolation support activities. So right now you can expect every hostage is getting a battery of medical exams to make sure that they're physically okay, but they're also meeting with experienced psychologists to start getting them set for the reintegration into their former lives.
What does that treatment look like on the medical perspective? You can't go eat normal food, right? I mean, they can't. What are they able to do? What are they not able to do? Take us inside what that process looks like.
You know, they have expert dietitians. When they walk in, people are really already geared to making sure they get the proper nutrients so that their bodies can take it. They not only know this from many years of experience, but really just in the last 2 years of taking other Israeli hostages from Gaza and bringing them into the system. But additionally, you go through a whole set of medical evaluations. For all you know, in 2 years, you might have developed a cancerous node. And, you know, people are going to have to look you over from head to toe to make sure that your body's okay. But the psychological thing's going to be important. They're going to have to go through periods of storytelling so they can kind of have a catharsis and telling their stories over and over again. But eventually they go back to their families. They'll keep meeting with their families, but eventually they return to their families. And then they're going to reintegrate not into their former selves, but to an extent, their new selves. Their former selves, that's long gone. They've been through an experience which has changed them, and they have to accept that and, in a way, integrate into their new self.
You mentioned the families. I mean, what kind of help do the families get in the longer term here? I can't even imagine living under that kind of stress for that long.
You know, the Israeli government did a pretty good job of putting the families in a good spot in terms of trying to give them information, although you can never give enough information, to be honest, but also to give stipends so that family members could leave their jobs and do full-time support in trying to monitor the case of their loved ones. And that continues on. So even after their loved one comes home from captivity, the families will still be able to access some sort of medical, financial, and psychological support. But the families are kind of the hidden story here. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum brought all these families together. They widened awareness on this whole topic. They were able to advocate to Netanyahu and his war cabinet, and they really are, I would say, played an outsized role in the recovery of their loved ones.
They have become kind of a political force in all of this. I can't imagine there's like long-term studies on this, but what does the prognosis, if you will, look like for some of these hostages years down the road? You mentioned the idea their old self is not the same. What does their new self look like long-term?
You know, before I think we got very smart on how to do post-isolation support, it was a 50-50. There were people that came back from captivity in, say, Afghanistan or other places in the years past that had a really rough re-entry. But now that we're more, I would say, experienced in how to do this, everyone stands a pretty good chance of reintegrating in a proper fashion. So I'm optimistic that they'll go reclaim their lives and do better.
We'll end on that optimistic note. We're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. More news ahead on NBC News Now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.